Great, thank you all so much. Now that we've had time to stretch, we'll move on to another important issue to be discussed today: radicalization leading to violent extremism. This phenomenon has many push and pull factors, and the process is not fully understood. To tackle it, we need to include young people. That is the focus of our second chat. Please welcome our moderator, Mr. Achim Steiner, Administrator of the United Nations Development Program, and our three speakers: Ms. Joy Bisara, a student at Southeastern University who was kidnapped by Boko Haram from a secondary school in Chibok, Nigeria in 2014. Dr. Sinisa Vukovic, Assistant Professor for the Conflict Management Program and Global Policy Program at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced Studies. And Mr. Faraya Al-Muslimi, co-founder and chairman of Sana Center for Strategic Studies. Welcome.
Thank you very much to our audience here today. Welcome to this dialogue, and thank you also to the President of the General Assembly for making this possible. We now have a group of 3 speakers here who will no doubt echo to many of the experiences, the issues, also the concerns that define our debate about violent extremism, about youth. I'm very honored to have been invited by the President of the General Assembly to moderate this session. My current role in the United Nations is that of being the head, the administrator, as it is called, of the United Nations Development Program. It's one of the UN entities that is very much engaged in this debate about radicalization, but very much from the point of view of trying to understand the origins, the sources, the causes, in order not to allow the responses to be defined only by the symptoms we observe. And not surprisingly, perhaps to many of you, it is my conviction and belief, as it is that of many across the world, that first of all, radicalization is the product of being marginalized, of being left out, of being left behind, of being discriminated against, but also of being viewed by others as a very ripe target for being recruited. That's where the connection to radicalization and extremism begins to happen, and I'm sure we will hear from our panelists in a moment more about that. But what concerns me the most, and I have just returned also from a trip where UNDP, together with the Office of Counterterrorism, organized the second global meeting on prevention of violent extremism in Oslo last week. We brought together for the second time people who work constantly on this challenge of how do we prevent violent extremism, and not as a kind of counterterrorism or counter-extremism strategy, but rather as embedded in a larger understanding of what makes people in our societies, first of all, feel so excluded. Secondly, what makes them so attracted to perhaps the option of becoming an extremist, whatever that may mean in different contexts. And thirdly, also, what makes people susceptible to being drawn into this? We have victims, we have perpetrators, we have people who have gone literally from being the pride of their father and mother at the age of 16 to being a terrorist in their very own community at the age of 18. And these stories are stories that at the end of the day, in each case are individual stories, and yet when we sit together as a global family, we also have to ask ourselves, what does this tell us about what is happening around us? And that is really a part of the reason why we're here together today, and we want to reflect on what is happening around us. I end my brief introductory remarks by just saying I was particularly keen to join you for this dialogue because I'm very pained and very frustrated by the narrative that so often today looks to youth as being the problem rather than the solution. That looks to youth as somehow the image or embodiment of the problem of our time rather than the challenge that it rightly represents to those of us who represent our time in terms of what we have accomplished and not accomplished. And I look particularly to the panelists also to try and address this phenomenon that has often made people more scared of their own youth that next generation, then actually excited and optimistic about what they represent in this day and age to our communities, our societies, and therefore the future of what happens next. So, if I may start with Joy, since you're sitting right next to me, we have essentially 3 questions that I will pose to all 3 of you and then end the session with a question that is particular to each one of you in terms of your experience. For this to work, we have to accomplish our discussion in the next 45 minutes, which means brief and focused answers. You'll have multiple opportunities to weave themes in. And Joy, if I may start with you, how can we, who is we, society is what the question says, be more inclusive and tolerant to diversity? How can we ensure inclusion is an antidote to violent extremism? And is indeed inclusion an antidote to violent extremism? And the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being here with us.
You're welcome. Well, for my own opinion, how we can prevent that and how we can make it work is like, for sure we are all from different races, cultures, and beliefs, but respect, love, and care, all those 3 words are what will bind us together. As long as we care about each other, we respect each other's background and race and just different beliefs, that's all we need. In order to move on and not and stop fighting each other, we have to have the heart to love and care for each other. And I do believe that if we have all those 3 words, then the world will be a better place.
Can I just ask a little follow-up, Joy? So if that is all that we need, why do we seem to be in so many places across the world, and you saw this firsthand, why do we seem to be failing at something that in essence is so simple, and why are people able to exploit that failure so effectively as it seems in many countries?
Well, what is making us different, and we're fading away from what we're supposed to be doing, is because we're raised differently and we're from different places, and depending on what we have went through and what we have learned and how we've been raised, that's where the differences start to come up, and that's how others won't respect other people's belief. Like when you go to a place for the first time, you're from a different place and you eat different food, you're just very different from everyone. If you don't open up and want to just learn from this new country and just be open-minded and loving and caring, even though this is a different thing from what you're used to, like being open to learning and just seeing yourself as one of those people will help. But if you don't see yourself as one of those, just because you have a different skin color, then that's what is leading into the fighting, and just differentiating yourself is what is causing the fight and just not liking each other.
Thank you very much, Joy, and we'll come back to you in a moment. Sinisa, as somebody who spends his time studying, being an assistant professor in global conflict or conflict management, what is it that makes it so easy to use differences to divide societies, and on the basis of that also to, essentially persuade people to exit their own community and become part of another group or movement and opt for extremism in its widest sense of the word as an answer to that? What is it that allows us to lose that sense of inclusiveness and tolerance and love for one another? And what makes it so easily exploitable when the cracks appear?
Thank you for that question. It's a crucially relevant question to understand what drives radicalization and extremist acts. And to put things in order, we need to understand that we are all social beings, and we all strive to belong somewhere with someone. And in this drive, we always tend to associate ourselves with those ones that we feel have most attention, pay most attention to what we want. From a series of studies, now we already know that saliency of identity is one of the primary factors to mobilize. And saliency of identity means that the more you believe, the more you are being told, the more you are being raised into believing that you are treated differently just because who you are, and you are fed that narrative over a period of time, and you are socialized into it, it becomes a normalcy, it becomes a way of life for you. You cannot question it. You are easily then mobilized to fear the other, to be suspicious of the other, to neglect the other, to discriminate against the other, etc. The idea about identities, and we always forget about that, is that when we belong to a group, we automatically do not belong to another. There's always in-group, out-group dynamic. And this is the peril of identity, of culture, that always gets exploited by these most extremist factions. Why do they do that? Well, there's a series of reasons. One of the most common reasons for it is the automatic systemic collapse of structures that exist around. So the group that lures you in substitutes the system that has failed you. And young people, especially people between the age of 12 and 19, are most susceptible to these types of messages. So any type of activity that is aimed at preventing extremist acts should aim specifically to those most vulnerable groups, those most impressionable groups, those groups that are an easy prey for these types of master narratives. And if I can just make a point on this, young people, and I'm glad that this is broadcasted around the world, young people, the only time a change is possible is when you question the conventions you are being raised in. And I know this is a difficult issue, but the point about conventions that consolidate discriminatory, marginalizing acts against the others are what furthers the ability for future mobilization of extremist values. And young people, in order to make a difference, need not to fight only the wars of their ancestors, but to live their own life and project their own future, and not just the future of their ancestors. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Sinisa. Very, very interesting. Let me turn now to Faria. When I was reading your CV, Faria, and you're only 28 years old, I thought they must have misprinted it because he has done so many things, including advising the Secretary General, leading the SANA Center for Strategic Studies. And you are here both with the first-hand experience of a region in which division and exploiting difference is a very real and present danger, even in the country that you come from. What has life taught you, and in both the personal observations that you have, but also in the work that you now do with the center, of what it is that allows tolerance and, in a sense, the appreciation of the other to have become so eroded, where societies sometimes for decades, even centuries, have lived as communities alongside each other, and into that enters ethnicity, religion, ideology, and seems to be able to crack that sense of community so quickly?
I guess it's the whole conceptualization of the problem, or parts of it, is we look into tolerance, diversity, different ethnic groups as a problem. How can we deal with it? How can we be more tolerant, rather than as an opportunity? That set of mind, I think, is the first step in having these many misunderstandings. But another layer of the problem, at least in our part of the world, is wars. If you are from Yemen and you're 25, you have seen 15 wars in your entire life. That's something definitely, no matter who you are, no matter what effort you try to make, will get the worst of you. That's basically what wars do. So that's another level of the problem, I think. The third aspect of this problem, or the third aspect we are facing, is a programmatic and a and a political one. Everyone somehow is making an extreme effort to fight terrorism. Very few are fighting radicalization. And there is slightly a difference between the two of them. Usually radicalization is a step before terrorism, I would say. And if you fight it, you will probably not have to go to the next step. And radicalization takes a lot of formats. It can be nationalist, it can be religious, it can be ethnic, and so many other levels. But the third problem, I would call it, is the trust that is usually invested in youth. In a country like Lebanon, where I did my undergrad, at the age of 18, you can drink, you can smoke, you can drive a car, but you can't vote. But you cannot vote. That is a serious issue. If you are trusted with a car, but you're not trusted with your own vote, how do you think that this youth or this specific category of the society will basically get out of them? So I think that's another layer of the problem. We have seen, at least now, also another international and global problem of an increasing populism, falling structures, as you mentioned in your introduction, and an increasing communication tools and the communication world via technology, via social media, without, I would call it, without parallels for understanding, for bridges. So basically, we have the best possible channels and the best possible tools from communication and technologies with a little right agenda. And that's a serious problem in an increasing feeling of injustice, feeling of unfair, and feeling that you cannot be trusted to even vote. When a militia recruits a guy, they don't ask him to be in a specific age or to submit a CV. They basically have the trust in him to give him an AK-47 or so on. Contrary to governments or politicians who actually will put a lot of conditions in you in order to give you just a chance to vote. And that's a serious problem, I think, with the world structure and with government structure. Until we encounter it, we will be having more and more of these issues. And if you look around to how many wars we have, or conflicts, perhaps, rather than wars, we're facing today, unfortunately, the question will be is why are not everyone radicalized, rather than why we have some radicalization. It is an unfair, unjust, and incorrect set of programs, structures, and governments around the world. And that will be the beginning, I would call it, of fixing this problem if we want to.
Can I just follow up for a moment? If indeed that is the reality with which we grow up, you just ended your statement by saying, why isn't everybody radicalized? Well, maybe it's an interesting point. Why do some opt out in one sense and opt into another response? The fact that we grow up with differences is, in a sense, the story of human life, isn't it? We are born as boys and girls. We grow up in rich and poor environments. We are taught by our parents in our community to be Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Jews. Religion becomes one of those vehicles of defining identity. I was very struck, and I have lived in many places where both I myself and then my children grew up in multicultural environments, and particularly in schools. I found it quite intriguing that somewhere up to the age of 10 or 11, identity in the sense of differentiation is something that children actually don't respond well to. They see each other as people that, I like you, I don't like you. And then something happens in the teenage years. And part of that may simply be, more observance of difference, but I would also posit socialization. Parents are at the forefront of actually instilling in their children identity. But in so doing, they may often inadvertently also begin to sow the seeds of, you belong here and not there. These people are different from you than us. How much is that socialization already the seeds of where maybe later in your life you suddenly become much more susceptible to that? So structural reality, but then the very subjective individual growing up, where your life is influenced.
Another subjective point I would make, for example, is when you look to terrorist groups like AQAP, like BokoHaram, like other groups, at least in some parts of the world, when you look to their second-level leadership and first-level leadership, they're usually not poor people. They're actually people who come from a well-economic off, which actually distorts all the myths that government says that it's poverty that lead to radicalization. But what they have in common, at least, for example, in groups like AQAP and others, what they have in common, their leaders, is they have felt irrelevant or politically unempowered is there is that sense of feeling that makes you feel marginalized, that makes you feel not connected, and that there is no self-fulfilling. As a young man, as someone who's growing up, you have a lot of energy, a lot of thoughts, and a lot of motives, and a lot of hopes, and a lot of dreams, and that is usually knocked down, especially when you're very intelligent. Most of terrorists around the world are actually engineers, according to statistics. Very smart, very intelligent people. But they have had no other way to channel this intelligence, to use it for the best of the world. And instead, it was used or it was channeled for something wrong. So I would argue it is that sense of political involvement, of political participations, and of feeling relevant of what's around you. And as long as that exists, we will have a serious problem, in addition to the identity problem that he mentioned, and that where we are mixed of or we're built of so many different identities, in which sometimes one of them, especially when feels threatened, takes over the others and they start being radicalized and looks into one identity as on the expense of another one, or on the threat of a different one.
Thank you very much, Faria. Joy, let me turn back to you. I mean, your life, in some respects, has been like a roller coaster. In 2014, you were part of the Chibok girls. You were kidnapped. You eventually managed to escape. Today, you're at the Southeastern University in Florida, and you can both speak to these issues from the immediate experience of being at the receiving end of this extremism and radicalization, and today you are studying at a university and you're able to reflect on it. We were asked to dwell for a moment on the role of media and social media and communications. Do you have a sense, in terms of the community you come from and where you look at the world today, how important is media and social media in actually making people move into the direction of extremism and become convinced that they're actually doing God's work or some greater work in becoming extremists in their society and becoming violent extremists?
Well, for me, I think media, it's both ways. It contributes to the violence, and it can also prevent it. So, for example, like the media is where the terrorists use in order to communicate to their members that are far away from where they are. And the media is where they find information on what to do next and where to attack and where to go. And the media is being used to say things. You can say whatever you like on the media and just criticize someone, or just leaders that you don't like. You can say things that can turn them into bad people instead of who they are. So, and the media can also be used in order to send a message that, okay, those terrorists are coming, you need to flee from where you are. It's used in a good and also bad ways. So I don't know how to really put it, but I think media is good and also bad.
Can I, for a moment, still use the very personal issue that and link that you have to the experience of being kidnapped? Because one of the more extraordinary moments that followed the kidnapping of the Chibok girls was this extraordinary global movement, hashtags, Twitter messages, social networks, first ladies, presidents, youth across the world mobilized around freeing the hostages. Do you think social media has shown a power to deliver this? I mean, is it something that you could maybe give an example in Nigeria or anywhere else where you say, here we saw the good that media and social media can do, with a more specific example?
Yes, like, for sure, media was really good when we got kidnapped, and that's how every single country heard about it. You cannot hear anything if there is no social media. And they support it, and there is a hashtag, bring back our girls, and all of this, like being supportive and asking to release the hostage and all of this. It was actually really good. And by the media saying, okay, this happened, so people will get to know that there is something really bad that is going on and needs an action quickly, kind of, it's, I don't know, but I know that it's a good thing, and it's also bad because, like, the media can also, like, when the BokoHaram attacked our school, it was the media that they were using in order to get our voices, like, while we were, like, struggling and crying, and just, it was the media that they were videoing us, and it was the media that they used in order to deliver a message to the government that, and show the girls that they're doing fine, but they need something in return in order to release the girls. It's being used as good and also bad. And I see the media as a good thing towards, like, when we got kidnapped, and just like how they were supportive, and that's how Congress Wilson, that's how she heard about it. She heard about it on the media, and she went to Nigeria, and through her, she's the one who found scholarship for few of us to come here. So that was a good thing. So I don't know.
No, very, very good response. And if I turn to Sinisa, I mean, obviously, you know, like all things in life, you can use them for good things or bad things. I mean, the analogy of driving a car. Maybe voting is much more dangerous than driving a car, and there's a reason to why we're only allowed to vote at 18. But, you know, cars can be, you know, used for getting us from A to Z, or they can be used as vehicles for attacking. So maybe the question is better put, Sinisa, to you. In the context of conflict management, how do we deal with media being used or abused? Because very often conflict resolution, or even the origins of conflict, can so powerfully be shaped by what happens in media, and now social media. What do we learn from how we deal with this, and how do we maybe stop the propagandistic use without curtailing freedom of speech? Is that possible? And how do we perhaps encourage media to play a more proactive role in this?
Media is a very broad phenomenon. The expectation of democratizing media has been equal to dynamite. You know, the invention of dynamite was intended for good purposes, but then it got hijacked by bad intentions. The same can be said about media. And from just basic observation, we can see that today people are more in tune to watch media, follow media, observe news that are already confirming their convictions, that are already reaffirming their ideals. It is becoming clustered into or compartmentalized into groups or subgroups. And there is not a lot of cross-communication between these subgroups. And media is generating this type of exclusivist identity, that I'm going to watch specific media and I'm going to follow specific news because I believe that their news is trustworthy because they confirm what I already know. And breaking away from earlier convictions, from the conventions that we have, is one of the most difficult re-socializing dynamics that a young individual can go through. And now young people are being an easy prey by extremist groups who know that through media they can reach out to them and tackle those specific root causes as you define them, or I can call it provide a pull-in element that pulls them in, that drags them into a group, gives them a sense of belonging, gives them a purpose, gives them a mission, something that they can aspire to, gives them an illusion of betterment by joining the group. And the media is a catalyzer of those types of messages. The biggest problem about contemporary media is that this overwhelming democratization of media has created a platform through which information is not filtered, it's not checked. So there is a lot of information that is easily manipulated and targeted in a packaged in a specific way in order to just mobilize and galvanize particular groups. not to provide alternative thinkings, not to provide broader meanings, etc. No, specifically to target, or to micro-target, if I want to be more technical, micro-target those groups that feel most marginalized, most vulnerable, and to mobilize them to the cause through very tailor-made messaging. So how do we deal with that? We need to be more aware of this type of missing bridges between messages that exist in media, and to understand that just by speaking to the like-minded groups will not make anyone else's minds change. And young people especially need to be aware that there are multiple platforms other than those ones that they most like, or that replicate the narrative that they have been already socialized into.
Thank you, Sinisa. Faria, in a world that you put a lot of your attention to, the emergence of social media is sometimes linked to radicalization simply because people were suddenly able to realize how miserable their conditions were in comparison to others, to put it very bluntly. Is that a legitimate assessment of the impact of social media? I mean, is the sudden advent of the internet and the world of information that allows a young person to compare themselves to others out there really such a new phenomenon? And does it in part explain what is happening in the conversation about why is my life like this when others are living a completely different life?
I mean, as a millennium, you can't say bad things about social media. But there are a few bad things about it. One is, as you were pointing very correctly, is many times it has given us a lot of data on the expense of information. And there is difference between data and information. Data can confuse you more than it actually can inform you. It can misinform you more than it can actually inform you. So that's one thing. Second is, social media can highlight a problem, can highlight an opportunity, but to do something about it takes a political decision, takes a governmental decision. Social media can tell you there is a tragic story of beautiful girls being kidnapped by BokoHaram there. But to do something about it is really something, is up to governments. And this usually creates more frustration. One example is, for example, the Syrian revolution, where there was this assumption in 2011, even there was this massive organizations donating cameras to activists on the ground, saying, film it, film this, tweet it, Facebook it. And there is an assumption something will be done about it. Something actually was not done about it. What happened is you saw governments and different governments massacre people in the street, and we watched it alive, and nothing was done about it. So in that case, I would argue it backfired. It actually created more sense of, there was an assumption that if it is tweeted, if a problem is tweeted, something will be done about it. The harsh reality is no. It might get few thousand retweets, few thousand likes, but nothing beyond that. And that definitely created more a frustrated generation, created more space for radical groups, and was abused by groups like ISIS. More than anything else, ISIS is a social media phenomena, is a phenomena of media, of communication, of PR, of abusing this frustration and of using an online platform. But I think that goes back to a serious, larger problem that has to do with conflicts, with apologies to the major, is there's a big difference between conflict resolution and conflict management. And what we are doing right now is there is a management of conflict. Let's manage Yemen war, make sure it doesn't get out of Yemen. Make sure that we don't see refugees out of it. Let's manage Syria's war. Let's manage the Congo war. And that's different from resolving these conflicts. And managing wars and conflicts end up in more wars, actually. And it ends up in more costs and in more danger than what we look at it. And ultimately, of course, as we all have seen, leads to much more radicalization.
1 minute.
Just briefly,
yeah.
To follow up on this, the elusive nature of conflict resolution and how much conflicts actually then exacerbate the situation. We always forget that there are high expectations when awareness is created. The infamous CNN effect, that the people are being presented with a looming catastrophe, with a crisis that is unfolding, and that something needs to be done. We have seen it over and over around the world, where there was a strong sense of mission, a strong sense of duty, a global responsibility to do something, but then there was a shortage of delivery. And we've seen it in Darfur, we've seen it in many other places where there was a lot of, and I'm sorry if this becomes a little bit unfair as a judgment, but a lot of noise even around active or proactive engagement that needs to be delivered, and then there was no delivery. You can understand that then the frustration with the existing both global, regional, local, communal systems that miss this opportunity to proactively tackle an issue that is happening in front of their eyes creates an illusion or an impression that maybe this is not working, maybe something else is working. Oh, look what the message I'm getting from the social media, that here is a different approach to these things. So media oftentimes create a sense of urgency, but oftentimes that sense of urgency is not met with the delivery. And this may just exacerbate the situation even further.
Joy, I'm going to give you a very specific question, but because of time also, I'm going to weave in just as an addendum to it also the question that we were supposed to discuss, which is, and we have in part begun to, how can education access to decision-making, whether it's voting or participating in your community or having a right to speak up in your family, in your church, whatever it may be, help prevent violent extremism. But it's more as a backdrop that I want you to perhaps touch on that. The question specifically to you is, as a woman, do you see the role of women and of young women in particular in addressing and preventing violent extremism as something that is both unique and different to a general debate in society? Do young women have a particular role to play, whether from your own experience or from what you have observed around you?
Yes, young women do. And what young women can do to prevent violent extremism is like, we're still young and we're getting like how to raise kids. Like if you raise your kids, putting them to follow the right way, like to respect others, and just, even though they have a different belief or they're just different from you, but still respect that and just love, no matter the differences. At the end, we are all the same, so there is no point spotting people out saying, okay, don't go there because they're different from us. Just raising your kids the right way, that's a really big role we can play in raising like young minds and knowing that we are all the same, and no matter the differences, at the end we're still all the same. So there is no point differentiating or like raising them to know how to like respect others. It's the really big deal. And if they can respect people no matter the differences between them, then we have played our own role, and I believe that the world will be a better place.
Can I ask you, and you can say, look, I don't really want to comment on that, but in the attack that Boko Haram undertook, it is noteworthy that they attacked both an educational institution and specifically targeted girls. What do you read into that decision? Coincidence? Deliberate? A big message they were trying to send?
Well, first of all, when they first even came in, like the first thing they said was girls are not supposed to be going to school. And they warned us that we shouldn't be going to school. And even though we go back to school, they're still going to come and hunt us down. We cannot go to school. We're meant to stay at home and just take care of kids, and we're not meant to go to school. That was what they said. But for when they said that, I thought they were going to, okay, let us go and just not to go to school. But they ended up putting us all in a truck and taking us away. And, well, for me, I believe that everyone have the right to education. Like, every single lady have the right to go to school. And if that privilege isn't given, then that's an issue. And if we are not educated, then we won't know how to raise a family. We won't know how to, like, be supportive to our family and how to just raise our own kids in a very good way. If you're not educated, what you will do is also to prevent your kids from going to school. So it's a good thing that we women are given the privilege to also go to school and be educated, more especially quality schools, and we deserve that. And I don't see anyone having the right to prevent or to say that we're not allowed to go to school. So I still believe, no matter, like for me, just like they said, even though we came back home, we shouldn't go to school. But I'm in school because I have a dream. I have to pursue that dream and accomplish what I want. I want to become a doctor, and a doctor I will become, no matter what. And God is seeing me through, and that's it. Nobody's going to stop it.
Well, Joy, the fact that you're sitting here today as a student enlisted in a university just goes to show that your dream was stronger than the nightmare they were trying to message with this. So well done for being here. Sinisa, a quick reflection on where do you think do we need to rethink the way we approach the prevention of violent extremism? I'm trying to sort of come back to the, let's say, overview that everybody who sits anywhere around the world can kind of say, well, yes, that is a good framework with which I can start doing something in my community. You know, we've had lots of debates about causes and symptoms and all of this. And, you know, we live in a world where military and security responses today are very often the kind of order of the day, when actually they are, in many respects, a late response to failures far earlier along the way. If you look at today's world and how it is responding to violent extremism, where would you identify one or two areas that really need to be rethought? They need to be challenged because they're taking us in the wrong direction. And what would be the right direction?
It is a multifaceted issue, at best, kind of simplified. In essence, prevention is very elusive. Prevention is an ambition that is driven by the idea that early warning signals can be easily detected, and acting upon those early warning signals, we can prevent something from further escalating. And we need to have some form of confirmation that if something was not done, there will be inevitable escalation. It's very difficult. I always say this, have you ever seen anyone being awarded a medal for preventing World War III? Yet, we always prevent World War III on a daily basis. We do something that prevents that escalation, that oftentimes may be just automatic, but we're doing something right. And when I say we, I mean international community at large. So when it comes to violent extremism, preventive tools need to look at what is the source of radicalization, even though this word in itself does not mean that once you are radicalized, you are automatically engaged in extremist acts. There is a big leap from carrying specific ideas to carrying specific acts. The idea of societal failure to meet the expectations of an individual, and I'm specifically now talking about an individual, is the best starting point, is that it is an individual that commits that act. But it's the individual that is being mobilized by a group that manages to target those individuals' specific desires. So the society is failing on several fronts. It may fail on providing basic public goods, sanitation, housing, infrastructure. It can fail on other public goods such as education, opportunities, etc. The problem about this is that we always then try to tailor a solution based on the best image we have elsewhere. And international community oftentimes is vested with this responsibility to go to a different location every time and to use the best examples from previous iterations carrying their know-how and apply it to this new territory. This is very difficult because oftentimes contextual differences make a huge difference in the application. So if I can now just limit it to, let's say, education. Or job opportunities, or anything that international organizations are driven to provide. We oftentimes see the mismatch between what kind of education international organizations or NGOs, international community, is supporting, and what type of education is actually necessary for those people to uplift themselves from, I don't know, misery to poverty, or from poverty into something better. We know of a term, employability, which internationals oftentimes just make. So you have 20 tailors in a village where there is no job for tailors. So you give them a chance to educate themselves, you give them a dream, but then they don't have anywhere to work. So it is understanding the local needs, the local capacities, and the only way this can be done is actually if talking to people on the ground and not trying just to tick the box. If ticking the box is enough, we would not go far.
Thank you, Sinisa. Very insightful, and leads me to, Faria, to the last question to you. If there is one myth that you would like to tackle head-on, and you've touched on some of the elements already today, on this whole issue of radicalization extremism, what would you point to? And I'm struck here by a report that UNDP published last year, Journeys to Extremism. Some of you may be aware of it. It was based on interviews with about 700 former combatants, either still in jail or who had returned to their communities, that essentially traced their story, their journey of how you went from being a member of a community to being a recruit to an extremist movement. And two facts, for example, were to me very interesting there. When asked the question, what was the tipping point for you to join these movements? It was, in 70% of the cases, government action. It doesn't explain the alienation, the radicalization, but the moment I decided to cross the line, which is what you were just alluding to, is when I saw in my own village the very reaction to extremism turning into something that killed my brother, saw my father disappear, and so on. And the second one was that the longer somebody attended religious education, and since this was mostly in the Sahel region, it was in madrasas, Islamic education. Interesting enough, the longer somebody attended religious education, the less likely they were to join these movements. So I just put these two findings forward because there's a great deal of mythology and a great deal of manipulation also in this debate about radicalization extremism, particularly when it comes to youth. Which one would you pick as the biggest one we have to tackle head on?
No, when in matters to the myth, I would look deeply again to the second point you raised, which is on religious radicalization, or that the myth that if you're more religious, you will be more radical. I just landed yesterday from Yemen, and I was doing some meetings, focus groups, including with fighters in both sides, and in fighters with youth fighters who joined the various radical groups. And it exactly echoes what the report talks about, and I was trying to look at it for our 2250 progress study. But my overall conclusion was that the next generation of Qaeda are atheists, meaning that they join this group for any reason you can think of except religious. And the problem is these radical groups have adapted themselves to absorb all of these energies, including those who don't have to necessarily be in any way religious. And what that means exactly from a programmatic point of view is we need to adapt or readapt our approach to fighting these issues. In another word, the former old hat we come with of understanding and conceptualizing that it means you're religious, it means you're radical, or it means you're radical is something that is an old story and something we have to look about. We have to relook into it in many ways. What that also means is peace in every society is different. The roots, yes, there are some general trends, some general commonalities, but in fact, war motives or conflict motives in this part of the world is different from this. In some parts of Yemen, there are people who have been killed, and then there are front lines, like, for example, Al-Bayda, which is a place of front line, a place of Al-Qaeda, and so many other things. In this exact area, there have been more people who are killed due to water dispute than actually the actual war and the actual fighting. So what that means is, what we usually have, whether the United Nations or any other organization or governments or peace brokers, is we come up with a recipe from Serbia, from Iraq, from Syria, from here, and say, we will try to replicate it in Yemen, we'll try to replicate it in Afghanistan, and that doesn't really work. Every society has its own dynamics, motivations, but also conflict resolution models that we have to look into. And what that means or what that needs, as we also suggest in the report we're submitting to the Secretary General, is what we need is a very different range of partnerships to actually bring peace to the world. Partnerships within organizations, with governments, with youth, with civil society, with groups. A complete redefinition of all peace processes we're looking into and we are conducting or we have conducted so far.
Thank you, Faria. And this closes the circle of our session, but I just want to end by picking up on something, Sinisa, that you referred to. Very often those who prevent, whether it's the Third World War or a conflict over a water well in a community, are the least recognized and yet the most vital members of our community. And what it points to, and I think this is important as we talk to young people across the whole world who are also listening in today, change actually begins with each one of us. We can be frustrated and passive, or we can be frustrated and become engaged. We can choose the path of advocacy, of resistance, of protest, or we can choose the path of violence. But at the end of the day, violence is not some abstract phenomenon. Radicalization doesn't happen in space or in the media as such. They are mirrors of what is going on within ourselves, within our societies. And if there's any reason why we should be having this dialogue here, it is only to help the world out there understand that wherever you are, the issues that you are confronted with actually show that you're not alone, and that there are millions of others who are struggling with the same issues in communities across the world. This building in which we are meeting here today is an everyday attempt against the cynicism of letting conflict and war and division prevail. It fails as often as it succeeds. And sometimes, and I think very relevant to our discussion here today, it also comes to an agreement that development is fundamental to actually ensuring that we do not fall apart as communities and societies. And in 2015, in the General Assembly Hall, the nations of the world agreed a new agenda for development, the 2030 Agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals. They are just one more example of how a United Nations is not the solution to all of the world's problems, but it is the one place where we can come and talk freely as nations, but also as individuals. And whether you are from the smallest nation or the largest nation, in the General Assembly Hall, you have a seat and you have the right to speak. And I'm very proud to have joined you all today to also demonstrate that the voice of youth in this organization has not only a vital role to play, its role is growing every day. And I'm very grateful to our panelists for the great discussion that you have enabled us to have. Joy, Sinisa, Faria, thank you very much. And to our President of the General Assembly, thank you for organizing such a day. It's been a great privilege to be here with you. And a round of applause.
Thank you so much for this compelling discussion. Let's give another round of applause for all the incredible contributions we've heard this morning. As a reminder, we're using hashtag Youth72, that's Youth72 on social media. We are feeding our minds and souls, and now we will take some time to feed our bellies. Let's all head upstairs to have lunch in the delegates' dining room on the 4th floor. Please take the exits in the back of the room upstairs as you will be guided to the luncheon. See you back here at 3 p.m. for our open mic.